First is a little introduction to you, Professor. So, welcome back to our second episode of our podcast. Today, our first guest is a professor from the politics department. She graduated with a bachelor's degree from Barnard College, continued on with her education from Stanford University, where she was awarded her MA and her PhD. Her areas of focus are on gender politics, sexuality politics in Latin America, but also on a global scale. She's the author of Unfinished Transitions, Women and the Gender Development of Democracy in Venezuela, which speaks of women organizing in Venezuela and more specifically goes in depth about women's participation in democracy in Latin America. She's also the author of Interpreting the Internet and Queer Counterpolitics in Latin America, a co-author to Sovereignty, Democracy, and Global Civil Society, State-Society Relations at UN World Conferences, and has published articles on the topics of transnational women's organization, intergenerational feminism, women's rights in Latin America, and same-sex marriage. Without further ado, please welcome the lovely Professor Friedman.
Thank you.
I hope I got everything correct.
Thanks. I'll just mention one other thing since you so kindly had looked up my record of book publications. And my most recent book brings my two areas of interest really into dialogue with each other. It's called Seeking Rights from the Left, and it's a comparison of the way in which both gender-based and sexuality rights and movements fared under the left-leaning governments that characterized the region from what's called the Pink Tide period in Latin America, which was basically early 2000s up to the 2010s until the end of the demand for commodities from China. But that's another story. And the reason that I wanted to mention it is it wasn't a single authored or a co-authored book. It was an edited collection, which meant I co-authored the introduction, but the rest of the chapters are, each of the rest of the chapters is focused on a different Latin American country. And that really characterizes a lot of the work I've done recently, which is to work with other people, particularly scholars from the region, to see what I can do here from North America to elevate their work and amplify their voices, which is very important to me.
And this just came out? Or?
No, this came out, it came out in 2019.
Okay.
And then I'm very proud of this. It came out in Spanish in 2020.
Oh, wow.
And not only that, but the Spanish publication circulates for free.
Oh, very.
So it's, we really, all of us who are part of this project, we're very committed to making sure that our findings would circulate in the language. It's not the only language of the region, but one of the dominant languages of the region, given the importance of the subject. So getting work translated is a whole other undertaking. It shouldn't be, but it is, even with Google Translate. And it really took a tremendous effort that was shared with myself and in particular some of the authors, some of whom not only translated their own chapters, but other people's chapters. And then we worked with an editor, a Spanish-speaking editor, who made sure that all of the chapters use the same terminology across, across the book. And so it was a real collaborative effort.
Oh, wow.
I feel like translating a book is really hard.
Yeah.
It's because even when you're translating things, speaking, some of the meanings are always lost in translation.
Oh, absolutely. And that's always been a really fascinating challenge for me working in a region where I'm quite proficient in Spanish and I can manage in Portuguese, particularly if I've been in Brazil for a little while. But I've always been aware that catching the nuances is something that I need to rely on other people and those deep kinds of conversations. Anyway,
Oh, wow.
not to get off on that.
No,
That's a big
that's
issue
so
when you're
interesting.
working cross-culturally,
Yeah.
And so,
as you know.
Yeah.
Very well.
so multiple people collaborated, and they were Latin American authors on each
There were a
chapter?
mix.
Okay.
We had a Canadian author, we had Latin American authors, we had some authors from the U.S. It was an interdisciplinary undertaking, so people from different disciplines, not just politics, political science. And we stretched from graduate student to full professor. So it was, a real effort in building intellectual community across a lot of different kinds of borders.
Oh, wow. No, that's
Yeah.
super cool. Well, thank you for,
Sure, so that's what I wanted to make sure it got in there.
And just to get
Yeah.
to know you a little bit more,
Mhm.
why did you choose Latin America as your concentration? Like, all your research is on Latin America. I mean, I know that some of your research is also on like the LGBT community, feminist community, and like all that. But like, why Latin America?
Why Latin America? Yeah, why Latin America? Well, my understanding of really of how politics works has from a fairly young age always been, in a sense, seen through the prism of the impact of U.S. politics on the region of Latin America. And I would attribute that to the fact that I grew up right across the bay in Berkeley, California. And I was in high school in the 80s. And there was a very active solidarity movement, an ecumenical solidarity movement that not only drew together a lot of student energy, but also went through different churches, mosques, and synagogues to draw attention to the damage that U.S. policy was doing in that very fraught period of Central American political development. And I won't go on my lecture, but you're welcome to take Latin American politics and find out more about this. And so, from teaching youth politics, I'm also really aware that high school and college are really seen as the most fertile times for developing your own
kids,
political views and what we call political socialization. And so when I was going through that, it was happening in a context where around me, I could see that there was a lot of really deep concern about, again, what U.S. policy, what kind of impact U.S. policy was having in Central America in particular.
And still having.
Yeah.
Well,
And still having.
It's still happening.
absolutely. It's still happening. That's right. So I think that really made me concerned and conscious
Right.
about Latin America. And so I did a little bit of coursework on Latin America when I was in college. And of course the politics and U.S. Latin American politics continued to evolve at that point as well. And so when I started my graduate work, I was pretty clear that I wanted to understand this even better and have an opportunity to do research on the other area that I had realized was very close to my heart, which we could talk about or not, which had to do with the way in which gender and sexuality have, tremendous impacts on every type of politics and policy that you can think about, but that often the way in which political institutions and political leadership had been constructed have a deleterious impact on women, feminized populations, what we call now LGBTQ populations. And so I was really interested in seeing how those two preoccupations and my curiosity about those could come together in terms of understanding better what was happening in the Latin American region.
Yeah.
And you brought up the kind of the intersection about gender in Latin American politics, or just these dynamics, the women's daily life.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to ask you, what were some of the challenges that arose when talking about these things, because they're very complicated issues.
Yes.
In Latin America, it's a region full of machismo, and that's a big topic that is ingrained within so many Latin American families, not only like within living in Latin America, but that translates over here into the U.S. as well, you know. So I just wanted to ask you, like, how is it working with that and actually getting to address and talk to these women, you know?
Absolutely. And men.
Yes,
Women and
yes,
men.
and men.
And increasingly people who identify differently
yes.
with regards to their gender, which has been such an interesting development to track and follow and be exposed to. So there's a lot to be said there. I do think, and I teach that that a colonial legacy in Latin America has to do with what today we still call machismo, and that it is not simple. It's very complex. It differs from not just country to country, but inside of countries and inside of it has different resonances depending on the class structure, race and ethnicity, right? All go in there, because the Spanish and Portuguese gender ideals, or what, as a social scientist I would say gendered institutions, that they brought and in a sense attempted to impose, whether deliberately or not deliberately, more organically in Latin America, of course intersected with the various kinds of, sort of gendered, what we would call gender norms that, again, are different in different places and different indigenous civilizations. And so that intersection that really happened, the impact from the period of colonization is so dramatic in so many different areas, but it is definitively one of those legacies from that period. And because, as you two know very well, Spain and Portugal were the major, sort of colonial powers in the region. And Spain colonized so much of Latin America that I think helps to explain why what today we call machismo is so widespread.
And the religion. The religion is also a big part of
absolutely, yes. And so then you want to think, well, where do those gender norms come from? And a lot of them are upheld through the Catholic religion, which of course came along. La espada y la cruz, right? I mean, we're very familiar with that. That Latin America was conquered with the sword and the cross, although you probably know. I'm sorry, I'm getting into a lecture here, but that the power of the Catholic Church also has varied over time, and even back in the day, we had Bartolomé de las Casas, and sometimes the Church tried to be a bulwark against the extreme violation of indigenous rights and lives, although not culture, which is a problem to today. So sort of a Catholic ideal very much upheld, sort of other aspects of machismo. So anyway, I promise I'm not an anthropologist or a historian, but as somebody who's been teaching about and learning myself about Latin America for so long, I feel like I'm ever more convinced about, the sort of the weight of the past on the present. And so I would say that when I started doing research on, these questions I had about gender and politics is where they started. Most of my research was in Venezuela when I started, and it wasn't that Venezuela was a pure macho society or anything, but it was early enough in sort of the articulation of what gender and politics meant that I got pushback not just from men, but also from women who are like, oh, you're one of those North American feminists
with different ideas.
And it's not like that here. It's not like that here. And of course they were right. It wasn't like that, right? We have our own contexts here. But just because it isn't the same doesn't mean that some of the general frameworks for understanding, the intersections of gendered and other forms of, relations of power don't matter. So a lot of what was so fascinating about particularly the early work was, trying always to test what I was and of course listening. Most of my research has been based not primarily or exclusively, but always with reference to conversation, to interviews, as well as, you know, not just ones that I myself had, but those firsthand accounts and studies coming from the region about things that people were curious about there, and the questions, as we were talking about before about Spanish, but the questions they knew how to ask. And so you know, I learned about how things worked differently sometimes there, and one of the big realizations I had in with my first big research project, which was doing the research for my dissertation, which eventually became that book on Venezuela, was how to talk about what it meant to be a feminist or have a feminist perspective. Because when I first came in to have conversations about feminism, that's where I got the most pushback. I think because there was that sense of, okay, there's some of a very few sort of, you know, very well educated women on the political left who've had exposure to these ideas for very long, but the longer, you know, I was able to do research, and then the more that the you know, that the academic community there took on the questions, I think the more a much more capacious understanding of what it meant to have a feminist perspective and to be a feminist.
I think like a big issue in Latin America, which is something that you already mentioned, is that people are not as aware or don't want to be aware. Like for example, I don't know, in Mexico, people think that they are not racist because they're Mexican. And it's like, no, we're racist. Like, you know, like people are not, they don't want to be categorized like that, you know. Like, how can we be racist if like we're Mexicans, like we're the underdog for like, you know, when we compare them with like Americans or like the US citizens.
Right.
And so much of the language is already, you know, like, you hear it it's so normalized, like in day-to-day conversations you use words like, when I was in Argentina, they use the word negro to describe someone who's poor, but they don't really see, you know,
they see it more as a
racialized
joke.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, oh, we're joking. Oh, like in schools too, it's more like, oh, it's just a joke. Like, can you take a joke? Like, it's like, I mean, I understand that it's part of like the culture, like having like this black humor, being sarcastic, like blah blah blah. But it also perpetuates this
stereotypes. And what's built on top of the stereotypes, which is the lack of opportunities.
I think it's like here in the US we have such a like an interesting perspective, you know, like to take over there. It's interesting because I don't know, like in a lot of conversations a lot of people will just see like, oh, you're just North American, like, oh, you just come from the US, you know, and they'll take it with a grain of salt. Like everything you say, it doesn't really matter because you're from the US. And of course the US has, like we have been saying this entire time, this legacy, this colonial legacy that continues on today, you know, and there's obvious, you know, like there's obvious power dynamics there. However, there's also things that we talk about that are normalized here, at least in California, like it's so interesting to bring that perspective into, you know, either Mexican culture, just like different countries in Latin America and how they choose to use their language, you know, because I don't know, sometimes like I hear my family talking, even here in the US, and I'm just like, maybe we can use different language, more inclusive language, you know, but at the same time, I don't know, maybe it's this inward struggle, like, is that really my duty, or do I just let the culture kind of, you know, like be?
Ooh, I think that's a difficult question.
Well, this is so interesting, and I really appreciate you sharing your perspectives, particularly your lived experience of these and what it means for you to, and you were just saying you've traveled recently, and I know that, you know, you still, I assume, identify as being from the region, that you yourselves are the pollinators of these things because you're carrying them, and you're carrying them in a way that I carry them differently now because I'm a professional and I have decades of research, but there was a sense in which I absolutely will always present as a white North American. Even though my position here in the US, particularly right now, I'm not any old white person. I'm also Jewish. I'm not, I present and I identify as a woman, but I'm also queer. And that means a certain set of things here in San Francisco, here in the Bay Area. And when I travel in Latin America, you know, increasingly I think there is a sense of, oh, okay, maybe you don't fit in just one box. But in any case, I feel like that this idea of pollination, that there are certain bees who can carry it because they are bicultural, they're in transnational families, and I feel like that's been, you know, a really extraordinary conduit, and not only today and not only in your generation. I mean, this goes back many years, particularly because, of course, the border crossed so many people's families. So in terms of, you know, what those relationships are and how far back they go. But I feel that, you know, when I listen to this conversation about, well, you know, what does it mean when I'm learning something or experiencing something in California, and then have these conversations, now I've had the, you know, sort of delight and privilege for decades now of people teaching me things when I'm in Latin America that I hope, at least through my, you know, sort of my publications and my teaching, that I can bring back here. And I think that, I know we don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but because we were talking about machismo and sort of, and how I and my impertinent questions might have been perceived back in the day. I mean, Latin America is the place with the strongest, you know, most massive feminist movements in the world, people, in the whole world. There's no debate on that. And to have observed this, you know, just explode across a region that I've watched for this long has been extraordinary. And the lessons for us here about all sorts of things just abound, right? And I think those lessons, a lot of them go way back, but to see it take place in a region that has been characterized by, you know, femicide, feminicide, discrimination, you know, really deeply rooted, you know, structured, gendered relations of power, you know, we got a lot to learn.
Yeah. And I think it's super. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. It's like the Argentina feminist movement. Like they used a lot of like intersectionality between like all this.
They did. Where'd that come from?
Yeah, like what? And like I feel like older Latin American countries should learn from that because like also they have like I don't know, when they sang the song, like it became battle and like all those kind of stuff.
Are you talking about the Chilean song?
Yeah, the Chilean song.
So
like with all the Latin American like getting together, and like.
But in Mexico too.
Yeah, and like I feel like
like
the only thing from Mexico, well, what I've seen from the feminist movement is people having. Like when there's news, the only highlights is like, oh, the women became violent, you know, like, oh, they broke this, oh, they're doing this to our city, blah, blah. Like those are the highlights. It's not like, oh, they're fighting because like this is happening to them, right? And something I'm learning from Professor Zuns in like strategic nonviolent action class is that like, of course, like movement is really powerful, but also a nonviolent movement is more powerful. So a couple of years ago, I'll just keep her name to myself, but perhaps somebody you know here at USF wrote, actually I've had more than one student now write a paper about the use of, and I'm going to say violence, by the Mexican feminist movement, particularly younger participants, and sort of breaking down what is violent against people versus violence against property. I know.
And I think that that before we judge a movement's tactics, we need to really think about where that
Yeah,
kind of
and also,
response
like-
came from.
Yeah, because it's something that is happening to me. Like, they're getting murdered every day.
Mhm.
So it's like, what do you mean you're more afraid of, like, the response rather than what's happening, you know?
Yeah, but the press
Yeah.
the press loves to jump on that, and
Yeah.
and I think people find it easier to understand. And the other thing about when you call women violent, what you're saying simultaneously is not just a judgment about their strategy, but also they're not being good women.
Yeah.
Because women aren't supposed to be
Crazy.
angry and crazy and
Yeah.
spray paint and
Yeah.
talk back to cops and
Yeah.
No, and I think, I know, going back, something interesting that, like, you were talking about was just highlighting, these women and saying that, like, Latin America is the region with, the most powerful kind of women's movements in the world. I think, like, people often overlook that because of machismo, because of how, like, big of a topic that is. And particularly from, I don't know, if you're not in the region or if you don't have family within or like no knowledge of it whatsoever, I feel like that often overshadows everything and it undermines, the efforts of so many of these women, of, so many just different movements like these. And one thing that comes to mind is like the women in Argentina who, Las Madres, who came to the square, like, who still continue to come to this square, like every single Sunday, I believe. I'm not remembering
Used to be
what day.
Thursday.
Thursday.
I don't know if it changed.
No,
the
maybe
day.
I think you're right. It is Thursday, and they honor the desaparecidos, and I think, just the act of showing up, people don't really cover it anymore because to them it's old news. It's not something that like is going to permeate through society because these desaparecidos are found. Which unfortunately, like, I don't know, maybe they will, maybe they won't be, or like records will be opened or something. But I think continuing to hear these stories and like I think continuing to hear these stories are just like wonderful things, and there's so much to learn, like you said, from over here, because I think, I don't know, maybe we think we're a lot more ahead of the game than we actually are.
Oh my gosh. Well, I hope we're not thinking that in this particular moment. I think if anything.
Oh, no, yeah.
When I teach Latin American politics, and we talk, of course, a lot about regime change and the difference between democracy and authoritarianism, and the importance of having checks and balances on executives, and also issues about how to promote sustainable development. And I just can't help myself. Every class session, something comes up that is also, coming across our feeds in the U.S. And so,
Yeah, but what you say about the Las Madres, I feel like it also serves as inspiration. Like, for example, right now in Mexico, like, the buscadoras or something like that, they're called. The moms that are looking for kids that... so, like, I feel like it's, like, more inspiring, like, I feel like they drew from, like, also this movements, like, throughout Latin America.
Oh, yes, and sort of maternal movements, what we call militant motherhood. I think certainly when I started studying the region, that was a very common way for women to take on roles in the public, particularly under conditions of authoritarianism. And I think what is so devastating about the buscadoras is that a lot of them are active now because, of course, the situation in Mexico has just been a zona de peligro for so many young people, and the homicide rate has just, been extraordinary. And so it has often fallen to not just mothers, also fathers and sisters and brothers and neighbors and friends and wives and husbands and everybody, saying, "Donde están?" and to, testify that their beloved person was not a gang member, or if they were, it was because they had no other choice.
True.
Right? And But in any case, I think it's another way of also thinking about that colonial heritage. That and this is something I really learned by studying Latin America. That in the U.S., for many reasons, the feminist movement of sort of the 1970s, a lot of that conversation ended up pivoting around whether women had a choice to be mothers or not, and often was sort of, I wouldn't say a wholesale rejection of motherhood, but stop assuming that my primary identity will always be as a mother. Whereas in Latin America, there's been much more working through that maternal role. And I think what's really extraordinary is obviously it changes over time and again from place to place, but people in Latin America demanding the right to have full control over their bodies in order to be good mothers, which is, a way to say, yes, I accept that this is very important to me, and I will be a better mother to my children if I can decide.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think, that conversation, I actually took a class studying abroad called Identities and Stereotypes in Latin America. And one of the units was specifically on bodies in Latin America and how, just how important, we looked specifically at gender and how that intersects within the role of bodies and, the women's roles and how, they're viewed from the outside, but also the pressures, of society, what is does their body, of course their body belongs to them, but oftentimes society is telling them that it doesn't, they only have...
We can't say of course anymore. Did you talk about cuerpo territorio at all?
No.
Oh, okay. So that's a really, just with the focus on bodies. So I think very much coming out of the indigenous movement and very much women who are indigenous, sort of their understanding that they're not only that they should have rights over their bodies, but that their bodies are so intimately part of their ancestral territories that they don't, that sense of the need for control and autonomy is it's combined. It's one of a piece. So that when indigenous people talk about the need to preserve their ancestral territories and their relationship to it, particularly for indigenous women, they articulate that as fundamental to them, if not more fundamental, than their control over their own bodies, because they are of a piece, right? A very different cosmology, a very different way than, sort of Western civilization has taught us that we're separate from the land, and that the land is there for our domination and all of the rest. And so they talk about this idea of cuerpo territorio, that my body is part of the land, is my territory, and the territory is part of my body. And it's really interesting I think you'll be all ready to look into this.
Is it it's a concept has traction right now?
Oh my gosh, yes. In fact, I have a great picture I can show you later of indigenous women holding signs that says, sort of our body is our territory and our territory are our bodies. And I use that to illustrate that understanding feminism, again, there's a huge variety because of the ways that people interpret it through their own. And when I say experience, I don't just mean their individual experience, but the way they see the world and the way they experience the world.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. I can give you things to read.
That concept of bodies and not being tied to the land is it's so interesting to me, because it's not only indigenous what would you say, indigenous or not
cosmology. Well, just to give you a sense that it's the sense of how the whole universe works.
But it's it's visible in today in so many other global conflicts, you can tie that to Israel-Palestine as well. You can tie that to so many different conflicts, and I think there's so much just to unpack there and learn. I don't think we have time to get into it, but
in our classes.
That's a really interesting concept that I had honestly never heard before, and wasn't brought up abroad.
I have a good video.
No, that seems really, really cool. Yeah.
Okay.
I think
We can
So
move
that
on to like the closing questions, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to go on them?
Yeah, sure. So we're international studies students, but also our concentration is global politics and societies.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that you work in the politics department, but what do you think is like important, like this, having this intersection between in like politics and international studies? You know, like as majors.
Sure. Well, I can share something with you that I don't know if you know, but the international studies major used to be in the politics department.
Oh no.
And then yes, it was one of the majors that we also directed. And then, you know, there became a time where it was clear that there were enough students, that they, you know, we needed more faculty, and then the major was really developing into, well, it was an earlier version because the majors do sometimes change their curriculum. And I remind you of that history just to give you a sense that particularly for the concentration that you have, you know, and you mentioned you're taking a class with Professor Zunez.
Yes.
You know, I study Latin America. It is international, right? It is not U.S. based, and so there's a real intersection there when we're thinking about the rest of the world or international politics and society, sort of how countries and peoples interact with each other. Internationally, transnationally, globally. Let's talk about the differences. So there's a lot of synergy, and so Ana, I've had you as a student before, and I often have international studies students in my Latin American politics class. I also teach a class on gender and comparative politics. Because those are topics that, you know, I know are of interest to international studies students. And then the two departments have always worked very closely to make sure that, you know, you all and your department and the students in your department know about every class that could count towards, you know, towards your curriculum. And likewise, we advertise the international studies classes and the classes taught by international studies professors to our students, you know, if they will fit into our majors. So I think that there's wonderful collaboration. I know I think very highly of my colleagues in international studies. And of course, you know, as somebody who is international in my perspective, my teaching and research, it's wonderful to have more people who, you know, really know different regions of the world, and then we also have a lot of synergy around the kinds of themes we think about.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, no, well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day for this. Yes, no, we had a lovely conversation, and I'm sure there's a lot to unpack here, so I'm going to talk to you after this.
Wonderful. I look forward to that, and for all you people watching this, I'd love to have you in a class at some point. So,
what classes
Professor
are you teaching?
Friedman.
What class are you teaching next semester?
Oh, yes.
Next semester I'll be teaching the Gender and Comparative Politics class. I also routinely teach the Introduction to Politics class, which is a year-long team-taught class for the first years in politics. International studies students are also welcome to take that, and then I teach Latin American politics. We're kind of moving that to the spring. I also teach a class on youth and politics and other things. But the gender comparative and Latin American politics, I think, are the ones that would be of most interest to international studies students.
Awesome. Yes. Well, thank you, Professor Friedman.
Sure. You're welcome.
Okay. Very nice. I'm going to scoot forward.